Philozoopia.
Have you ever really stopped to think about profit? What it really is? Not just, a number on a spreadsheet, but what it means, how it moves through our whole economy, and those cycles we always hear about, boom and bust.
Yeah.
What's actually driving them underneath?
Yeah, the big swings.
Well, today, we're going to dive deep into a perspective that really shook things up over a century ago. And honestly, it still feels surprisingly relevant. Okay, let's unpack this. We're doing a deep dive today into excerpts from Karl Marx's Capital-Volume-III. Now, I know what you might be thinking sounds heavy, maybe like a textbook.
Yeah, it can be dense.
Right. But stick with us, because there are some genuinely surprising insights here. A very unique way of looking at how money and value will work.
Absolutely. Our mission, really, for this deep dive is to pull out the key ideas, the most, let's say, powerful nuggets from this material. It's dense, no doubt. We'll look at profit, capital, rent, these core concepts. But not just what they are. We want to understand why they still shape things today, often in ways you wouldn't expect.
And the source itself has a story.
It really does. It's important context. This volume 3, wasn't published by Marx himself. It was actually compiled and edited after his death by Friedrich Engels.
Wow.
Yeah, Engels did a massive amount of work. He described Marx's notes as a disorderly mass, comments, extracts. He had to piece it all together, even writing whole chapters to bridge gaps.
So Engels was almost a co-author, in a way.
In parts, certainly an essential interpreter and structurer. He even teamed up with Samuel Moore, a Cambridge mathematician, for some of the really complex calculations involved. It was a huge undertaking.
Okay, so let's start right at the beginning. The fundamentals.
Yeah.
Cost, price, profit. How do these actually relate to the value of things?
Right. So from this viewpoint, profit comes down to something called surplus value. The simplest way to think about it is it's the unpaid product of labor.
Unpaid profit.
Yeah. Imagine a worker makes enough value to cover their own wages in, say, the first 4 hours of their workday. Everything they produce after that for the rest of the shift. That extra value they create, that's the surplus value. It's value created beyond what they're paid for.
Okay.
And the rate of profit, then, is this surplus value divided by the total capital invested both machinery and wages. Now, here's where it gets interesting. This rate is really affected by what Marx calls the composition of capital.
Composition. You mean the mix?
Exactly. The mix, the ratio between constant capital and variable capital.
Okay, break those down.
Sure. Constant capital is basically your machinery, your buildings, raw materials, things whose value is just transferred to the final product. It doesn't really grow in the process.
What? Tools, materials. Got it.
Variable capital is your wages, the money spent on labor power. It's variable because labor is unique. It doesn't just transfer its value. It actually creates new value, including that surplus value we talked about.
Ah, I see. So the labor part is where the extra comes from. So wait, if I'm following this, even if the amount of that unpaid labor, the surplus value, stays the same, the profit rate could change just based on how much you spend on machines versus people.
Precisely. That's a key insight.
Can you give us that example from the source? I think that helps make it concrete.
Yeah, absolutely. The source uses a really clear numerical example. It's in chapter 13. Imagine two companies, and let's say the rate of surplus value. Basically, how much unpaid labor is extracted is exactly the same in both, say 100%. So the intensity of exploitation, as the text calls it, is identical.
Okay, same level of extraction.
Right. But company A invests, say, 50 pounds in constant capital, machines, materials, and 100 pounds in variable capital, wages. Their rate of profit works out to 66 2/3%.
Pretty high.
Yeah. Now, company B uses much more machinery. They invest 400 pounds in constant capital, but the same 100 pounds in variable capital wages, same workforce size, same extraction rate, their rate of profit, it drops dramatically down to just 20%.
Wow, from over 66% to 20%, just by changing the technology mix.
Exactly. The underlying exploitation hasn't changed, but because more of the total investment is tied up in machinery that doesn't create new value, the rate of profit on the total investment falls. It's kind of counterintuitive, isn't it? You'd think more machines, more efficiency always means a higher profit rate, but not necessarily according to this analysis.
That really is a profound point from this text. So thinking about today, what does that suggest? You could have like a super automated tech factory versus maybe a restaurant chain that relies heavily on human labor. Even if the way they manage labor, the exploitation level as the source defines it, is similar. their profit rates would look completely different on paper.
That's the implication, yes.
So how does that work out when they're all competing in the same market? Does one drive the other out of business?
Well, that leads to the next crucial step in the argument. If you connect this to the bigger picture, yes, different industries with different capital compositions would initially have very different profit rates. But then competition kicks in. Capital tends to flow out of the low profit rate sectors and into the high profit rate sectors.
Seeking the best return. Makes sense.
Exactly. This movement of capital continues until the different rates tend to level out, converging towards an average rate of profit across the whole economy.
An equalization.
Precisely, an equalization. And this very process, the text argues, is what can make it hard for an individual business owner to see where their profit truly comes from. Their profit looks like it's just a return on their total capital investment generated by the market, rather than specifically stemming from the surplus value created by their workers. It appears to derive from the collective exploitation across all of society's capital.
It sort of obscures the source then.
It mystifies it, yes.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting for me. We've seen how the profit rate can vary between industries and how it averages out. But what about a deeper trend, like over the long haul? This is where the text introduces this idea. It's called the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. That sounds pretty dramatic.
It does sound dramatic, yeah. And it's a central argument in this volume.
This law, as the text presented, isn't some external factor. It arises from the very core of capitalist development, specifically what it calls the progressive development of the social productivity of labor. Meaning, we get better at making stuff, more efficient.
Exactly. Technology improves, processes get refined. And
Yeah.
what does that usually mean? It means the same number of workers can process more raw materials, operate more sophisticated machinery.
Right, more automation, more output per worker.
Precisely. But look what that does to the capital composition we just talked about. Constant capital, the value tied up in machines and materials, grows much faster than variable capital, the value spent on wages.
So that ratio shifts, just like in the example earlier.
Exactly. The very drive for productivity and efficiency inherently tends to increase the constant part relative to the variable part. And if profit ultimately arises only from the variable part, labor, but the rate is calculated on the total capital, well, mathematically, that rate tends to decline over the long run.
Okay, so if this is presented as a fundamental law stemming from the system's own progress, it sounds kind of, well, like a dead end for profit eventually. Why doesn't the whole thing just seize up? What stops profit rates from just constantly plummeting? The source must address this, right? It mentions counteracting influences.
That's a great question. And yes, the text spends a lot of time on these counteracting forces. It's not presented as an absolute destiny, but a tendency that's constantly being fought against. So first, there's economy in the use of constant capital, basically finding ways to make machines and materials cheaper or use them more efficiently.
Getting more bang for your buck from the non-labor parts.
Yeah, right. The source gives examples like incorporating safety devices into machinery design so they don't cost extra, or huge improvements in fuel efficiency. It mentions early steam engines by Cornish and Wolff needing only 3.5 to 4 pounds of coal per horsepower hour, while others needed 8 to 12.
Big difference.
Huge. And another fascinating aspect of this is using waste. The chemical industry is highlighted for turning things like coal tar, which was practically useless, into valuable products like aniline dyes, alizarin, even medicines.
Finding value in leftovers. We still see that drive today.
Absolutely. It's a constant pressure. Second counteracting force, depreciation of capital.
Things getting cheaper.
Or rather, existing things losing value quickly because of new inventions. Think about how fast technology makes older equipment obsolete.
Right. Your state-of-the-art machine from last year is suddenly slow.
Exactly. The text notes that the trailblazers, the first companies to adopt expensive new tech, often go bankrupt because their investment depreciates so fast. Then others can swoop in, buy the assets cheaply, and they make the money.
Ouch. Risky being first.
Can be. And this pressure also encourages using machinery, intensely long hours, day and night shifts, to squeeze the value out before it becomes worthless.
Okay, so cheaper inputs, faster depreciation, allowing others to buy cheap. What else?
Third, the text points to the increase of stock capital, particularly large joint stock companies, things like the railways mentioned in the source. Often, these massive undertakings yield lower rates of return, perhaps closer to the rate of interest rather than the full average rate of profit.
How does that help?
Because these huge chunks of capital are accepting a lower return, it helps prop up the average rate across the whole economy, preventing the general rate from falling quite as fast as it otherwise might.
Okay, like an anchor dragging on the fall.
Sort of, yeah. And finally, there's the expansion of the world market. Finding new markets, new sources of cheaper raw materials, new places to invest capital, this can definitely counteract falling profit rates, at least temporarily. Engels adds a note about this, helping to ease over-speculation in specific periods, like leading up to 1867.
So, putting it all together, the text suggests this incredible productivity, this massive buildup of capital, growing way faster than the population. It actually creates a contradiction. It says it contradicts the basis for which all this immense productiveness works. And that's the underlying reason for economic crises. These crashes are like this system trying to resolve that tension.
That's the argument presented, yes. Crises are seen not as accidents, but as inherent cyclical releases of these built-up contradictions between production capacity and the ability to profitably realize the value.
Okay, so we've gone from production, how profit is generated there, the tendency for the rate to fall and the things pushing back against that. But stuff doesn't just sell itself once it's made. It needs to get to market. Money needs to change hands. Where do merchants and bankers fit in? Do they create new value? Let's look at commercial profit.
Right, moving into circulation. The source is pretty explicit here. Commercial capital, meaning the capital of merchants, if you strip away functions like storage or transport, which do add some value.
Just the buying and selling part.
Just the buying and selling part, it creates neither value nor surplus value.
So no new value created by the merchant.
According to this view, no. Their role is crucial, but it's as a middleman. They facilitate the realization, the turning into money of the value and surplus value that was already produced by industrial capital.
So where does their profit come from?
Commercial profit is seen as a portion of the surplus value produced by the total productive capital. It's a cut, a slice of the pie that industrial capital already baked.
How do they get that cut?
The idea is that the industrial capitalist sells the goods to the merchant for slightly less than their full value. The merchant then sells them at their full value, or close to it. That difference is the commercial profit. The merchant takes a share for handling the sales process.
That's a really interesting way to frame it. So the merchant isn't adding value, just taking a share for facilitating the sale. And you mentioned something earlier, a historical shift.
Yeah.
That merchants used to be more dominant.
Yes, that's a fascinating point in the text. It notes that, historically, say in earlier trading economies, it is the commercial capital which first determines the prices of commodities, and it is originally the commercial profit which determines the industrial profit. The merchants held the power.
But that flipped.
It flipped as capitalist production became the dominant force. Then, the industrial producers gained more control over setting prices, and commercial profit became more clearly a deduction from the surplus value generated in production. This whole process of circulation heavily involves money, of course, which brings us to money capital and real capital and the credit system.
Ah, the banks.
The banks, yes. The source uses a striking example from Scottish banking back then. It showed how just £3 million in actual physical currency could support deposits totaling £27 million.
Wow, like 9 times multiplier.
Exactly. A single £1,000 in cash could, as the text puts it, multiply itself into a sum of deposits absolutely indefinite. This really highlights how the banking system transforms not just money, but also debt claims and promises to pay into this powerful thing called loanable money capital. It seems like capital is just breeding more capital, at least on paper.
And the source connects this to real historical events, right? It's
Yeah.
like that boom and bust in England in the 1840s.
Yes, it dives into the period 1845-47. There was the Opium War indemnity flowing in, plus a massive speculative boom in railway construction, the railway mania.
Right.
This led to rampant over-speculation. The text describes how companies made huge shipments of goods to places like India and China, not necessarily because there was real demand, but purely to get cash advances against those shipments from banks.
So moving goods just to get loans, a purely financial game.
Pretty much. Leveraging the credit system to fuel speculation. And inevitably, it led to a crash when the bubble burst. And you see different attitudes towards this system. The text quotes Mr. Norman, a Bank of England director. He tries to define capital quite technically, commodities or services used in production. But then he makes this odd claim that interest would still exist if there was no money at all. A very abstract, almost theoretical defense of interest. Hard to picture. Right. Contrast that with Samuel Gurney, a big-time banker. Asked about market fluctuations in 1848, he just bluntly says, "All fluctuations in trade are advantageous to the knowing man."
Chuckles.
Yeah.
Okay, no beating around the bush there. Tells you who benefits from instability.
It's quite revealing, isn't it?
Absolutely. And the source also talks about the impact of specific policies,
Yeah.
like the Bank Act of 1844 in England. It wasn't good for everyone, apparently.
No, not at all. There's testimony from a private banker named Twells. He said the act afforded a rich harvest to bankers and money capitalists of all kinds. London's joint stock banks were apparently paying dividends of 22% to their owners.
Wow. Great for them.
Great for them. But Twells adds it was very badly for the honest, industrious tradesmen. Why? Because the act led to wildly fluctuating discount rates, the interest charged on short-term business loans. This meant many small merchants couldn't get credit when they needed it, their bills went unpaid, leading to bankruptcies.
So the big players thrived while the smaller ones got squeezed.
That's the picture painted by Twells, yes.
Yeah.
And the overall point the text makes here is that a significant chunk of this money capital circulating around is, in its words, purely fictitious.
Fictitious. Neat.
Meaning it represents claims or titles, things like government bonds, company shares, rather than actual physical productive assets like factories or machines. Real capital.
Paper wealth versus actual stuff.
Kind of. And this distinction becomes really stark during crises. You might have a situation where commodities are super abundant. Warehouses full of goods, nobody can afford to buy, they're inconvertible into money. Yet at the same time, because everyone is desperate for cash, money capital, interest rates can shoot sky high. So you have high interest rates for money, even while real capital, factories, materials, is sitting idle. It just shows a real disconnect.
Okay, so we've got production, commerce, finance. There's one more big piece in this puzzle of how wealth gets distributed, according to the source: land. How does simply owning land, which isn't produced by human labor in the same way commodities are, also allow someone to claim a share of the wealth? This brings us to ground rent.
Right, ground rent. The focus here is mainly on differential rent. The text explains it arises primarily from two things. First, different outcomes from applying the same amount of capital and labor to different pieces of land. Obvious example. One piece of land is naturally more fertile than another. Or maybe it's better located, closer to markets.
So nature gives one owner an advantage.
Exactly. The source uses the example of a waterfall on a piece of land. The waterfall provides free power, creating a surplus profit for the business using it compared to competitors relying on steam engines. Because the waterfall is tied to the land and can be monopolized by the landowner, that extra profit gets converted into ground rent paid to the owner.
They didn't create the waterfall, but they can charge for access to its benefit.
Precisely. The second cause of differential rent is applying successive doses of capital to the same piece of land. Maybe the first investment yields a high return, but later investments, perhaps using less fertile parts or requiring more drainage, yield less. The landowner can still charge rent based on the higher productivity of the initial investment. The text also notes how competition among farmers, especially for smaller plots, can drive rents up. It mentions that for small tenant farmers, maybe on less than 70 or 80 acres, the rent they pay might actually eat into what should be their own wages for the labor they perform on the farm.
So they end up paying rent partly out of their own pocket, effectively.
That's the implication. It really raises a fundamental question the source wants us to consider. What does it mean socially when owning a piece of the planet, something you didn't necessarily create, allows you to continuously claim a share of the value produced by others?
It's a stark point, and the source doesn't shy away from the human side of these economic forces, does it? There's that really powerful anecdote about John Cross.
Ah, yes. That's incredibly striking. John Cross, a farm laborer in Dorsetshire, earning just 8 shillings a week trying to support himself, his wife, and 5 children.
8 shillings for 7 people.
Unimaginable. And he gets caught stealing a wooden hurdle, like a small fence panel worth 6p. For fuel, presumably, and he's imprisoned for it. The source quotes a contemporary report asking how they keep body and soul together, and then contrasts this grinding poverty directly with the weariness of satiety, the boredom of having too much supposedly felt among the wealthy elite. It's a brutal contrast, and that human cost connects back to the drive for efficiency we talked about earlier, that economy in the employment of constant capital. It wasn't just about cheaper machines. It often meant cramming workers into factories with terrible conditions.
Cutting corners on safety and health.
Exactly. Overcrowding, poor ventilation, leading directly to higher death rates, especially from respiratory diseases. The text cites reports by Dr. John Simon in London showing shocking mortality rates for trades like tailoring and typesetting, directly linked to their working environments. The pursuit of profit had very real, often fatal consequences for the workforce.
So within the factories, who's actually running the show? What about the role of management and supervision? Does the text see that differently from owning the capital?
Yes, it draws a distinct line there. It observes that historically, as businesses grew larger, the function of management increasingly became separated from the actual ownership of the capital. You started having salaried managers running things for absentee owners or
Okay,
shareholders.
the rise of the professional manager.
Exactly. And the text points to cooperative factories, factories owned and run by the workers themselves, as evidence. It says they furnish proof that the capitalist has become no less redundant as a functionary in production as he himself finds the big landowner redundant.
Wow, strong words. So the argument is the manager's work is necessary productive labor. The capitalist owner, just by owning, isn't performing a necessary function in production anymore.
That's the core of the argument presented. Management is work. Ownership, in this view, is primarily a claim on the surplus value generated by that work and the worker's labor. Profit, therefore, appeared, as the text says, in practice, as it undeniably appeared in theory, as mere surplus value, a value for which no equivalent was paid by the owner in the actual production process. And it even goes on to criticize what it calls a new swindle, emerging in joint stock companies, where boards of directors might be appointed not for their management skill, but as a way to plunder the stockholders and amass wealth through high salaries, bonuses, and insider dealings.
So let's try and pull this all together. We've gone on quite a journey through this deep dive into Capital Volume 3. You've really helped us dissect these complex mechanisms, how profit originates from surplus value, according to this view, how the rate of profit tends to fall but is counteracted, how finance and commerce take their cuts, and how even land ownership extracts wealth, and the stark human costs often lurking behind these abstract economic forces. It's clear these historical insights, curated just for you listening, aren't just dusty old ideas. They offer a really powerful, maybe challenging lens for looking at our economy today.
Absolutely. I think if there's one big takeaway, it's that these sources really hammer home the idea that economic relationships aren't fixed. They're not natural laws like gravity. They are historical, they evolve, and they're full of contradictions. That separation of management from ownership we just discussed, that's a prime example. It points to this evolving situation, raising questions about who actually creates value versus who simply appropriates it based on ownership.
Exactly. And that leaves us with a final thought, something for you to maybe mull over. Considering how much production today is socialized, huge companies, complex supply chains, professional management teams coordinating everything, yet the profit generated often remains highly privatized, flowing to shareholders who might have zero involvement in the actual making. What does that tension tell you about where things might be heading? Or perhaps where they could head? What might it look like if the act of making, of creating value, and the act of profiting were somehow more directly, maybe more equitably aligned? Something to think about.
Philozoopia.